There are a lot of IQ tests online, but I am very skeptical about their accuracy.
I might actually be a genius.
I have an IQ of 105.
131.
133, look at that.
You are so much smarter than me.
But is IQ even a good way to measure intelligence?
He scored too high on the intelligence test. He was not hired because his IQ was too high.
People on the internet like to talk about their IQs. Behind the IQ though is a long and twisted story. A story of one man wanting to do good, scientists falsifying data, and lots of smart people. This is the IQ story. A child prodigy is a young child who has very great ability in some discipline. These disciplines can include maths, art, or music. Many scientists have tried to understand how child prodigies come to be. One such researcher was Laszlo Polgar. Polgar was a Hungarian scientist who studied intelligence, and over the years he gathered data on numerous child prodigies, hoping to uncover the secrets behind their brilliance. And he found one recurring pattern. Child prodigies seem to start practicing at a very young age. He developed a theory. Polgar believed that every healthy newborn could become a genius, provided they were raised with the right approach. But how can you test such a theory? Well, Polgar had a, let's say, personal experiment in mind. He wrote a series of letters to his acquaintance Clara, explaining that he needed to have a wife that agreed to raise the children to become child prodigies. In the beginning she was reluctant, but she eventually accepted his proposal, and both got married. In the next years, the couple had 3 daughters, Susan, Sophia, and Judith. All 3 daughters were homeschooled, they learned multiple languages. Soon the parents decided to focus on chess. Fast forward 2 decades. All 3 daughters became chess grandmasters. Judith Polgar even became the greatest female chess player of all time. On the internet, Judith Polgar is also celebrated as one of the smartest people in the world, with a staggering IQ of 170. IQ is often used to rank the abilities of a person, but IQ is much more problematic than most people think. IQ was never intended to measure intelligence. At least not by its inventor. At the end of the 19th century, a law in France was passed that required every child to attend school. Soon an issue became clear though. Not all children learn at the same pace. So the French government assembled a small team to develop a test that determines if a child needs special education. The famous psychologist Alfred Binet was part of this team. Alfred Binet was born in 1857 in Nice, France. Originally, Binet aimed to become a lawyer, but later focused on psychology and eventually became the director of the Laboratory of Experimental Psychology at the Sorbonne. He and his student Theodore started to study the abilities of children at various ages. They then devised a series of tasks to assess children based on the number of tasks they could successfully answer. But can you pass the task? Task 1. Follow the light beam. Well done. Task 2. Talk back to me. You just talk to the device, it's kind of weird, but you made it. Last question. If someone asks your opinion of a person whom you do not really know, what do? According to Binet, good answers would be, one must be silent, or one must not talk without knowledge. So yeah, everyone on Twitter would fail the test. After months of work, Binet and Simon created the Binet-Simon Scale, a set of 30 tasks that were representative of typical children's abilities. The idea is that every child gets some questions right, but not all of them, so that they can be ranked. Children with low scores can then receive additional educational support. Binet thought that this test should only determine if children need special education. The scale, properly speaking, doesn't permit the measure of intelligence, because intellectual qualities are not superposable and therefore cannot be measured. One of his biggest fears was that this test would be modified and used to measure intelligence in the general population. So 5 years after his death, researchers at Stanfort modified Binet's test to measure intelligence in the general population. The test was slightly changed and now focused on attention, problem solving and memory. It was also at this time that the term IQ or intelligence quotient was used to define the mental age of a person. If a child was 10 years old but acquired the mental age of 12 in the test, their final IQ score would be 120. Louis Terman, one of the developers of the Stanford Binet intelligence test, toured around the US to promote his test. He also coined the term gifted when describing children with IQs over 140 and became one of the main reasons why the Stanford Binet test became so widespread. IQ tests were employed by schools across the country and the US military to screen for gifted children and potential soldiers. Great, now everyone could do an IQ test and link their intelligence to a number. What can go wrong there? Oh, In the 1920s and 30s, some psychologists put forward the idea that some ethnic groups might inherently have lower IQs. This led to the use of IQ tests to screen immigrants arriving in the US, and it was found that immigrants overall performed badly in IQ tests. But these tests were only available in English, and many immigrants were not able to speak English by the time they arrived, so that's that. In 1927, the US Supreme Court legalized the forced sterilization of over 65,000 citizens with developmental disabilities. That's bad.
In the 30s and 40s, other governments even took it further.
The Third Reich employed eugenics as a pretext to justify the sterilization and extermination of entire populations. The results were devastating. After the Second World War ended though, eugenics was abandoned by scientists.
You would also expect IQ tests to fall out of fashion, but they made a quick recovery.
The WAIS Adult Intelligence Scale was developed and became the standard IQ test we know today. There are two main differences between the WAIS Adult Intelligence Scale and the original Stanfort Binet test. First, the WAIS Adult Intelligence Scale provides the test taker with scores in various subcategories. This test combines the results of the subtests in one measurement, a full-scale IQ score. The WAIS Adult Intelligence Scale also compares the test taker's score to those of other test takers in the same group. This means that the test results of each person can be depicted in this distribution. If you have an IQ of 100, you scored better than 50% of people.
With this new branding, IQ tests became more popular than ever.
I recently asked you guys,
And over 60% of you answered that you have taken some form of IQ test.
but still IQ tests found a way into job positions. But not in a way you might think. Robert Jordan wanted to become a policeman. As part of the admission process, Jordan had to take an IQ test. He scored an IQ of 125, which is above average. Unfortunately for him, 125 was above the maximum allowed score, and therefore Jordan wasn't hired. In fact, it was the policy of the police department to only accept applicants with average test scores. Jordan simply scored too high. He tried to appeal in a federal lawsuit against the city, but lost. Quote, "The policy might be unwise, but was a rational way to reduce job turnover." Yeah. All the IQ tests taken over years and years help us to understand how the human brain works. A major discovery was made by American philosopher James Flynn. Flynn found that the IQ in the population has consistently increased throughout the 20th century. The changes were rapid, with measured intelligence typically increasing by around 3 points per decade. Over 46 years, the average IQ in the US increased by 13.8 points, and other countries followed. This phenomenon is called the Flynn effect. The Flynn effect is mostly explained by improved education and nutrition, combined with reduced pathogen stress. In the 21st century, the Flynn effect has stopped in many countries, as people do not score higher anymore in IQ tests.
And even worse, there are now reports of the so-called reverse Flynn effect, which means that people now score a bit worse in IQ tests than only some years ago.
There are still debates about why IQ seem to go down in some studies. One of the major theories is the so-called dysgenic fertility theory. This theory states that a decrease in fertility makes traits worse. It is well established that humans have become less fertile in the past decades. Could this decline in fertility also imply a loss of favorable traits such as intelligence? Or are we simply getting too dependent on technology? Whatever is happening here, does IQ even matter? Or in other words, what does IQ actually measure? It depends a bit on what IQ test you take. Broadly speaking, IQ tests can measure fluid or crystallized intelligence. Some tests focus more on fluid intelligence. Here, no previous knowledge is required. Questions can be answered by logic alone. Look at this image. What shape follows? Other IQ tests focus more on crystallized intelligence. Here, facts are asked. When was the day your father left to get some milk? Crystallized and fluid intelligence together constitute the general intelligence factor, or G factor.
While editing, I just saw that Veritasium made a video about IQ. It's a great video, he explains modern IQ tests step by step. So shout out from a small to a huge YouTuber.
If we want to know if IQ or general intelligence measures something meaningful, we can start to ask if it reflects something in the brain. Let's start with brain volume. Early studies have not shown a link between brain volume and general intelligence. However, more modern studies show a slight correlation between bigger brains and better IQ scores. More detailed analysis found that the volumes of local brain regions impact IQ scores. These regions include, and get ready, the insular frontal anterior superior and medial temporal posterior lateral occipital cortices, just to name a few. But these associations are very weak and only occur if thousands of brains are scanned. We need something else to understand IQ. Maybe we'll find the answer in our genes. Scientists try to find out if certain genes impact IQ by conducting twin studies. Twin studies take pairs of twins and investigate the differences between them. If IQ is dictated by our DNA, twins should score similar in IQ scores. And in fact, one of the most remarkable findings of twin studies is that the heritability of intelligence is extraordinarily large, in a range of 50 to 80%. You might argue now that twins are often raised in the same environment. But then scientists found something else, the Wilson effect. The Wilson effect states that the heritability of our IQ increases with age. While roughly 20 to 25% of IQ scores is inherited during early childhood, this number increases to 80% from the age 20 to 50. What this means is that as we get older, our IQ scores tend to become more similar to those of our parents. When scientists realized that genetics seem to impact IQ scores, they tried to find out which genes are involved. And they still try to find it out. Today we know that thousands of genes impact intelligence. In 2018, a large study involving 269,000 people identified over 1,041 genes that have been shown to slightly impact intelligence. And with slight impact, we mean that the strongest genes only explain 0.1% of intelligence. But these effects are so small that right now we can only explain a fraction of inherited IQ. High IQ scores are only slightly associated with bigger brain structures and with thousands of genes. Not really astonishing, but there is one last thing. High IQs are a strong predictor of work success and achievements. But that's not all. Researchers try to analyze other factors that might impact IQ scores. And they repeatedly found one thing: motivation. When participants are offered rewards for completing IQ tests, they score much better. How much? In 2011, scientists compiled data from 19 articles that used motivation as a predictor for IQ scores. In total, 2,008 patients were analyzed. And the findings were remarkable. When people are rewarded, they score better in IQ tests. This effect was specifically observable for people at the lower end of the distribution. Here, IQ scores increased by 0.96 standard deviations. And when we look at the distribution, this means that we go from here to here. And motivation is not temporary. The same researchers analyzed studies that followed children for close to 15 years. Also here, long-term motivation was associated with academic performance, employment, and a lower risk of criminal convictions. So IQ doesn't really measure intelligence, but it appears to be more like this. We often use IQ to describe intelligence. However, IQ and general intelligence are not as straightforward as they seem. And IQ scores have been criticized by many, as they only offer a very limited view of intelligence. Traits like creativity and emotional intelligence are often not measured in traditional IQ tests. So what in our brains makes us intelligent? That could be a topic for another day. If you want, feel free to comment that. If you enjoyed this video, you might also like that video, where we talk about how to get smarter.